Thank you. Professor Berleman.
Thank you very much. Kia ora. Thank you for inviting me to beautiful Aotearoa. I almost got it right. And please forgive me for my ignorance of your culture. I talk from the perspective of an American educator, and I do not presume to have understood all your problems. But when I was studying qualitative research and anthropology, I learned the terms etic and emic. An emic view of the world is an insider's view, and an etic view of the world is the outsider's view. And a Maori studying Maori culture is an emic view. A European studying Maori culture is an etic view. And those are different ways of learning. And an emic view of the United States, my country, from the inside, is we're going crazy. We're nuts. An etic view of your culture and what you're doing is you may be sane. Okay? Now, I'm not sure. It's an outsider's view. And I've heard enough of the problems to know that, you know, this is not paradise, even though that's how it was presented to me as a tourist. But you're really dealing with your problems in fine ways. And I congratulate you. And you'll notice, too, that my title has changed. Margie said between the abstract and the writing is 6 months. That's true, and I decided to share something a little different. I want to introduce you to those that are involved in trying to destroy public education in my country, part of the germ we've all talked about. They include such luminaries as Bill Gates, one of the richest men in the world, who said not long ago that our public schools are not doing well since the USA has increased its funding for education dramatically and the scores we see on tests are flat. He misunderstands the point about funding and simply lies about the test scores. Funding is up, true, primarily because of special education costs, and we should be very proud of that. We're taking kids out of their homes and educating them into the schools. We take them out of institutions, educate them in our public schools, and it may cost $40,000 or $50,000 or $70,000 for one of those kids. That's something a nation should be proud of instead of saying it costs too much. Transportation costs are up. Mr. Gates didn't seem to notice that the cars run on gas, and gas prices have gone up over the years. And now testing and technology have made costs go up. So of course school costs have gone up, but it is not any evidence of waste, malfeasance, or high salaries. Then on the other side of that, we also know that NAEP scores are up. That's the National Assessment of Educational Progress, like NAPLAN in Australia. They've actually shown 30 years of slow and steady growth, straight up, and for black kids in our country, it's up steeper. They've gotten far ahead of where their parents were 20 years ago. So sound arguments and good research tell us that Bill Gates lied, and we decided to tell him. So we did. And by the way, well, I'm old and I can't be polite, so lies are, I call them what they are now. And your Prime Minister, in a speech to the West Auckland Business Club this morning, said, and I quote, "A mountain of evidence shows that the quality of teaching inside the classroom is the biggest influence on kids' achievement," unquote. Now, I need to be blunt. Your Prime Minister lied. Every researcher in the Western world will tell you that's not true. Okay? It simply is not true. I'm going to talk about that in my presentation. But people say that. We finally got Obama to back off of that. He was saying it too. We got him to say, among the school variables that are very important are teachers. Okay. Who would argue against that here? But we have to understand the power of the outside of school forces. And your Prime Minister doesn't seem to know that. And in the new policy, he's assuming that he can fix the problems of schools by tinkering inside the school, when I have a hunch most of your problems come from outside the school. Anyway. Others in the germ movement include most newspaper editorial staffs, especially the New York Times, where the most influential journalists work for America's most prestigious newspapers. That group claims that Chinese and Koreans are outperforming us, that those kids are so much smarter than ours. Moreover, they say the Chinese will soon be the world's economic power, leaving the U.S. in the dust. People like these also say we need a much more rigorous curriculum, much more testing, and that even kindergartners should be given more rigorous homework and be tested. But they do. And it'll come floating over here eventually. Be careful. But there is a lot wrong with these arguments. For one, I'm old and I've heard all this before. First, the Russians were going to beat us. My generation was told we could not compete. We're lazy, we can't read, we liked rock and roll, we're impolite, we smoke too much marijuana, etc. But those high-achieving Russians didn't beat us. Then the Japanese were going to beat us because they studied so much more. But they've just come off 20 years of economic hardships, and they didn't beat us either. So I'm leery of this constant fear-mongering. I've heard it all before. In fact, it started with Socrates in Greece, worrying about the youth of his nation. He complained, as old folks always do, about the kids of the next generation. And he was right. Athens disappeared because of its youth, but 500 years after he was talking about it. So I saw a little of that here in New Zealand with your slightly lower PISA scores. All the doomsayers came out. They usually do with news like that. Also on the PISA scores, it's confusing to me. Three nations that usually do not do great on the international tests are Germany, the USA, and Israel. And all three are among the healthiest economies in the world, each with enormous exports and quite innovative corporations. So we're not sure what the tests predict about economic success. And in fact, there's good evidence that they predict nothing about a developed nation's future economic health. So all your doomsayers came out, you know, your future's going down the tubes. But in developed nations, the link between education and success is much more tenuous than it is in undeveloped nations, where as education goes up, the economy goes up. Another problem here is that Chinese and Korean childhoods are nightmares by my standards. If anyone in the USA wants to raise a Chinese-style or Korean-style student, they're free to do so. And it is true that those children do well in American schools. But we in the USA, and your Aussie cousins, and you Kiwis, if I figured you all out, have a view of childhood that is quite different than the one that prevails in China or Korea. You go bonkers over your All Blacks and other sports teams, and you actually want your kids to engage in swimming, tennis, field hockey, cricket, and rugby. And on weekends, you don't mind if your kids watch some TV or play with friends or hang out with the family. And so a number of your schools don't give homework. On average, you don't expect your kids to rush into the homework if they have it. And you approve of some team dances and dating, and you think it might actually be harmful if your kids studied all the time just so they could get high scores on tests. Well, think about that. You, the Aussies, and we in the USA have a view of childhood that will never, 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 never allow us to compete with the students of some Asian nations. Get over it. We might all ask a much better question, namely, how do adults in our societies do when raised according to our cultural preferences? The answer to that question in all three countries seems to be they're doing pretty good. That's the better question. I don't have any interest in test hell, as the Asian kids call it, though that's what my President and Secretary of Education are funding and pushing for in the USA. The question for my country, and for New Zealand, I think, is whether you are producing enough high-quality college graduates and business leaders for your economic system to thrive. In my country, the answer to that question is yes, and in fact, we are overproducing educated people to fill the jobs that we now have open. Well, we don't have that many jobs open. We're overproducing. And our president runs around saying STEM, 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 science, technology, engineering, and math. 60% of all those who got a master's degree in a STEM field 2 years ago can't find work in STEM fields. Okay? This is just nonsense that's being spouted. Among our continuing problems is that lots of famous and influential people say really inaccurate things about education, and we try to call them out, sometimes quite bluntly. They say you can measure the quality of the teachers by means of the scores their children get on standardized tests. Or they say that leaving back a child who is slow to learn is good for both the child and the school. But both these beliefs are demonstrably false. Good research exists to refute these ideas. Yet as I speak to you here in New Zealand, both of these ideas are becoming law as they are legislated in state after state with the full support of and coercion by our federal government. We have research deniers making policy, and it is infuriating. They are just like the global warming deniers and the evolution deniers, and they make bad policy. Famous and influential people also say things that are simply lies, and they do so without shame. The conservative Goldwater think tank and a famous TV reporter named John Stossel say that early childhood education is a sham, a scam, a bad idea. Or conservatives say money doesn't matter and a small class size reduction shows no effects. What we are seeing now is a well-coordinated and well-funded attack on public education. Let me tell you how this works. Los Angeles county school boards had a school board election. You know, our districts have school boards. And it was just a little school board election, and the usual amount of money someone pays to run for an election in a school board might be $10,000, $15,000, $20,000 for signs, for one TV ad, for flyers. $1 million was spent to get a seat on the LA school board, and it was all put up by conservative think tanks. Now, why would you want a school board seat? To make policy, okay? To make policy that's not in the interest of teachers or children, but to make money. And I'll tell you how they did that soon. Wealthy people, foundations, and corporations supporting the germ are now in ascendance in my country. They don't want to pay taxes to support public schools, particularly schools that have so many poor black and brown kids in them. They prefer choice schools, charter schools, and private schools to keep some kids, often their own kids, from interacting with lower performing students, English language learners, and special ed kids. They want greater accountability for the public schools, but not for the charters of the private schools. They also want all those incompetent teachers that they hear about who are protected by the evil unions thrown out of their jobs. They want to sell stuff to the schools and make huge profits, as recently revealed in Los Angeles and among charter providers in the country. The LA school board seat that went for $1 million, the LA school board allowed the superintendent to buy $1 billion worth of iPads. An iPad for every kid in LA. The only problem was he bought them for over the retail price that I could pay. When you're buying in bulk, most people get a discount, okay? So someone made a fortune, and it wasn't me. And so we're getting, on the new testing programs, the other thing about making money, the Pearson, which was people are talking about here too, Pearson is getting everything computerized, then the districts have to buy the computer services. In LA, the charters were found, charters are supposed to be public, they get public money, and the person running the charter school can contract with private people to get certain services, cleaning, transportation. It turns out they're almost always their brother-in-law or sister-in-law or uncle or aunt. So this is becoming a very corrupt system. Well, given all the sloppy reporting, the myths, the lies, and the strange beliefs we see reported all the time, we decided to fight back a little. We have a book coming out, 50 Myths and Lies That Threaten America's Public Schools, The Real Crisis in Education. And it'll be out the end of February, early March. You can see a puppeteer with the school. This is a book that debunks the myths and lies being told. Some of these are told to gain dollars from educational funding. Some of them are told by people who would destroy public education. Some are told by people that cannot ever let research influence what they believe. They seem to know the truth no matter what. Evidently, truth is revealed to them, and I don't seem to have access to it. Here is a sample of what we take on. Let me describe how we did this using research, poking fun at silly people, and also shaming some folks when we could. We made a decision in this book. If we can name names and make fun of them, we'll all be better off. First of all, we'll have fun. And secondly, shaming is a reasonably good strategy, okay? Because we don't know what else to do. So our book is about naming names and saying nasty things. We think if we have the research to support our views, we ought to do that. First, we took on the grand myth, the myth of myths, is that the American schools are doing poorly. You've probably heard about it. This nonsense is spouted regularly by our Secretary of Education, our President, the New York Times, Bill Gates, and all the privateers. Those wanting to divest themselves of the public schools include the American Legislative Exchange Council, called ALEC, Eli Broad and his foundation, the Walmart family, the Koch brothers, and a dozen other wealthy people and foundations who are promoting forms of choice and privatization. And as they do so, they badmouth public schools. But American public schools are really not doing poorly at all if you are middle class or above. Here's the most recent TIMSS data. This is the 2011 data from the Trends in International Math and Science study, in which 4 nations and some 20 other jurisdictions, such as some of our states, participated. What I say about this graph will hold for the PEARLS data, the International Reading Test, and the PISA data, which you're all familiar with. So let's look at the data, the top bar graph, displaying the 4th grade data in mathematics for the USA. You can see that in the public schools on the left, those where the majority of the students were not in poverty, marked less than 10% of the kids are in poverty, or marked 10 to 25% of the kids are in poverty. Those two groups on the left scored rather high, well above the U.S. average and well above the TIMSS average. U.S. average is dotted. The TIMSS average is 500, the solid line. You will also know that over on the right-hand side, where 50 to 75% of the kids are in poverty at the school, or 75% or more of the kids are in poverty in the school, they didn't do as well, well under the averages. Now, these correspond roughly to your deciles, okay? So if I did this with your decile data, it's the same. Over on the left, that might be decile 10. The next group might be deciles 9 and 8. The next one, the middle one, might be 6, 7, something like that, all the way over. So we did it in 5 groups. You have the 10 groups. Okay. Nothing startling here when you look at the kids in poverty versus the kids who are not in poverty. You all expected that kind of difference, though it is rather large, a full standard deviation between the scores of the average student in a school that serves the wealthy and the scores of the average student that serves the poor. Your 4th graders didn't do well overall in math on TIMSS. You came in with a mean of 486. But how did your schools do that served the wealthy? Do you know? I know. I looked it up. I looked at the deciles, and I found out that your pattern is just identical to this one. Okay? Now, on the bottom of this PowerPoint is the 8th grade data. Your 8th graders came in relatively better, with a score of 488, but still not good. But here is the point. Mean scores always hide variation. You must disaggregate to understand the scores you get. If the schools of the wealthy are scoring very well, as is true in both of our countries, then it's probably not a bad curriculum you have. Otherwise, they couldn't score that well. It's probably not bad instruction you have. How could they score well? It's not bad teachers. That's your problem. Your problem and our problem is most likely associated with the distribution of wealth in our societies and the relationship of family wealth to variability in child-rearing practices and in the quality of schooling offered to our children. Your Gini coefficient, the measure of inequality, is pretty close to the UK's and up there with the USA. Gini coefficients measure inequality in a society, and there is a lot of inequality in countries with remnants of British capitalism. I don't know how to say this nicely to my British friends, but they've really screwed up the world. If you look at Australia, New Zealand, Israel, which had British mandate, Hong Kong, a couple of other places where British capitalism was the mode of thinking, they all have huge inequality because the British class system was imposed on those places. And the only exception to that rule is Canada. That's because the French got there first, okay? And Canada's not great inequality, but it's in the middle of the pack, and most of the others are not. So the Northern European countries had a different view of what makes for a healthy economic system, and they have the inequalities are very, very low. One example from the U.S. We're running about 24% of our kids in poverty. Finland's running about 4% of our kids in poverty, okay? And a graph that Bob Lingrad showed you was if you took the Finnish 4% and changed it to 24% like ours, and our 24% and changed it to 4% like the Finns, we go above the regression line, they go below the regression line. We look great. So if that's possible with one variable, it can't be our schools. And those that say our schools are bad are either misinformed, that's nice, or they lie. Here's what's really interesting when we disaggregated this particular data set that's in front of you, the TIMSS data. The average fourth grade score for Finland was 545, meaning that in the U.S. schools that serve middle and upper middle class kids, the two groups on the far left, constituting about 15 million American public school kids, we did just fine, since those kids beat the average Finn handily. And the Finns were the one that were held up to us as a great national system of education. Furthermore, another few million kids also did well, those in schools where the poverty rate was under 50%, that middle group there. So when you disaggregate, about half of U.S. public school kids, those in the first, second, and third groupings in this graph, the three bars on the left, we find mean scores that beat the Finnish mean score. Roughly, this is deciles 10 to 6 or 5 here. In 8th grade, the bottom bar graph, the mean score of Finland was 514. Again, all three of these groups I'm talking about, where poverty was under 50%, tested just fine. Our conclusion is that there does not seem to be much wrong with mathematics instruction in the USA. The mathematics curriculum is fine, math teachers are fine, or America's public schools where kids in poverty are not in the majority would not be scoring so well. In the other two groupings, in schools where we also educate about half of America's youth, our kids are doing poorly. The takeaway from this? It isn't unions, it isn't the lack of standards or a lack of iPads or the lack of more school hours or more school days or any of the various other reforms we hear about from members of GERM. It seems that it is poverty and its sequelae, what follows from poverty, that harms school learning. And thus we cannot have higher achieving schools in the USA until we have a progressive society that limits the effects of poverty on families. I think that's as true in New Zealand as it's true in the USA and elsewhere. For example, if we use books at home as the measure of social class in New Zealand, your results are exactly the same as ours. The more books in the home, the higher the TIMSS scores, with a huge difference between those with a lot of books in the home and those with only a few. If books in the home is a proxy for social class, as it often seems to be, then social class is determining test scores as powerfully in New Zealand as they do in the USA. So this new measure by the Prime Minister that suggests that new principals, new lead teachers, new whatever they're doing inside the school, that's not where the power lies. The power lies in outside the school factors. I think every Western researcher will agree with a statement of mine now. If you look at the variation in scores of kids on tests, roughly 60% of that is explained by out-of-school factors. Roughly 20% of it is explained by in-school factors. And of the in-school factors, you do have leadership, curriculum, lots of other things, and teachers. And teachers, I don't know, maybe half of that 20%. So if we're talking about effects on school scores, maybe 10% of that effect is in the hands of teachers. Now, that's a lot. Teachers can have a huge impact on schools and kids, but I'd rather put my money on some outside of school factors. I recently did a very quick calculation. I'm going to ask each of you to do it at home tonight. From birth to 18 years of age, how much time does a kid spend in school? Okay, you got an answer? Well, then just work it out. In the USA, the answer sometimes comes out to about 10, 12%. When we think of school as this great, powerful force, and it can be. But if I had to put $10 down on what's going to influence a kid's life, it's family, neighborhood, community, because that's 90% of where they're going to spend their time. We do miracles with our 10% time. But we have to acknowledge that 90% of a kid's time is spent elsewhere. And it's hard to overcome that if it's working against us. So we tell those that say the public schools are not good that they are wrong. They apparently work quite well when they are allowed to teach children unscarred by the creation and maintenance of a large poor population. Here is recent Pearls data. This is the international assessment called the Progress in International Reading Literacy Study. Our kids in schools where poverty rates were low, the two bars on the left, outscored every other nation in the world. The president never refers to that. Secretary of Education says, we're not reading well enough. Well, hell, 15 million kids outscore everyone in the world. That's not bad. Those kids go to schools that serve families that are quite middle class and above in income, and their mean score beat every other nation in the sample, and there were over 50 other countries and jurisdictions in the sample, including yours. You did okay. Your mean score was well above the average, but not up there with many other advanced economies. But your data is bound to be the same as that of the USA. Scores on these tests are about cohorts. They reflect the composition of classes and schools. They have little to do with the quality of teaching in the classroom. I'm sorry. I'm a teacher too. I'd like to say everything is my responsibility, but it's not, okay? I can affect individuals enormously. I have changed lives, and my life has been changed by teachers. But that mean score of the class, that mean score of the school, I can't do much with that. That's a different factor. I might add a comment here about standards, because that's so concerning to you. It's an issue you all face as well. We have imposed on almost all our states what we call the Common Core State Standards. That tells us what every kid should know from kindergarten and every other grade, and I hear soon we will be extending that back to what they need to know at birth. So we don't have to adjudicate this the way you do and do the moderation and meet 700 hours over whether the kid is a 4 or a 5 or whatever you do. But it's important that the standards movement be understood because it's part of the germ movement. Right off the bat, we see lies are being passed off on the American public. First, the states didn't develop them. Even they're called the Common Core State Standards. They were developed privately through money from conservative organizations like the Gates Foundation. Second, the people who created them were not teachers. Third, the states are forced to use them by the federal government, who withhold money if states won't impose these standards on our schools. Fourth, the Common Core was seen as necessary by conservatives because of our purportedly weak curriculum, resulting in the horribly poor performance of our students on PISA, TIMSS, and Pearls. But you now know that's not true for many of our students. The logic of the Common Core is that we have a deficient curriculum, and yet 15 million of our public school students are among the highest scoring students in the world. So that argument is completely fallacious and made all the time. Fifth, the Common Core is a bonanza for testing companies because new assessments have to be made and they are all computer delivered. So the costs are now enormous and the profits are as well for testing companies and hardware suppliers. For example, Maryland, a relatively small state, will spend $100 million more on hardware in the next 2 years in order to deliver the assessments that go with the Common Core standards. And Los Angeles, which has lost most of its arts classes and has huge class sizes and many buildings in disrepair, spent $1 billion on iPads for testing and instruction associated with the Common Core. And as one might expect, when contracts are that large, corruption is rampant. I told you, they paid over retail for those iPads. I could have bargained better for them. Okay. Just recently, the results of PISA 2012 were released, and it showed the same thing I have presented. New Zealand's average score was actually a lot better compared to the mean score other nations received on PISA. But again, you were not an educational powerhouse, and you slipped a little bit in standing, so your newspapers and your doomsayers came out. Still, you beat the U.S. average handily on PISA, even if you couldn't do that in the America's Cup. I knew I shouldn't have brought it up. I knew it. It says here, don't bring that up. Don't bring it up. Now, actually, I rooted for you folks. So I thought since you folks, like the USA, are a nation with a lot of immigrants and a large indigenous population, you should understand the power of culture, which I'm talking about, in determining school outcomes. Obviously, you know that, listening to all the wonderful stories of the Maori culture and how it's come back and have schools of their own for language and culture. Culture through families and child-rearing practices is a powerful influence on test scores. Lower social class, indigenous people, immigrant groups often do not raise their children, as do the middle and upper classes of the society they live in, and those are the people that determine schools, school functions, school structures, school curriculum. Thus, we learn that the power of family and culture seems quite a bit greater than the power of ordinary teachers in ordinary schools in determining achievement test scores at the aggregate level, not at the individual level. I keep trying to make this distinction. At the individual level, we affect eternity. At the aggregate level, culture, society, outside of school factors are determining the overall scores. That's an important distinction to make. In the last PISA test, you know enough of the Common Core, I can skip that. Let's see. In the last PISA test, American Asians, without regard to wealth, poor and rich Asians alike, scored above Japan and probably were tied with Korea. That is, our Asians beat their Asians, okay? They not only beat all other American kids handily, which you can see from here, that's U.S. data on PISA. It's really hard to say our U.S. schools are bad when a subgroup of American youth can perform on tests like our Asian American kids did. Certainly our three largest minorities, Hispanics, African Americans, and Native Americans, are doing quite poorly. But it's hard to blame the ordinary schools when so many of the other students in public schools are doing remarkably well. You show that effect also. In one of the international tests, 20% of your New Zealand Asians scored in the advanced category, while only 5% of European New Zealanders did so, and only 1% of Maori and Pacific Islander New Zealanders did so. This is the third study I know of using the international data that show really large effects of culture and family on the achievement scores with the PISA test. We need to acknowledge that the culture of the country of origin, and thus the culture in which a child is raised, often trumps the culture of the receiving country when immigrants end up going to school in another land, at least for the first or second generations. Indigenous people have different cultures too, and they go to schools that are not culturally compatible with their family life, just like immigrants do. You have some new schools that acknowledge Maori cultural norms, and it appears they're doing really great, and I commend you for that. But the lesson here is the more immigrants accepted from low-achieving countries, you have Sudanese, we have Haitians, the greater the likelihood of lower scores in the receiving country, a problem we face in the USA with immigrants from Latin America, Haiti, and Africa. Let me demonstrate this phenomena because it's important to say again how powerful culture is and why we can't solve our problems inside the school alone, and we have to look for solving them with outside-of-school factors. These are the scores of Turkish kids in blue and the scores of European kids in red. These are Turkish immigrants. The zero line in this graph is the average for PISA. You will see that in almost every country, in every country, the Turkish kids do less well than the European kids of the country they're in, and there's sometimes rather dramatic differences, like in Denmark or in Belgium or Switzerland, or most of those countries. The scores of Turkish kids in Europe resemble the scores of Turkish kids in Turkey, much more than they do the scores of German kids, even after controlling for social class variables. Family and culture is powerful. Here's the same phenomena with a Hong Kong Chinese coming over to live in Australia or in New Zealand. Asians are in blue, Europeans are in red. This is the same data, presented slightly differently, that Bob Lingrad presented, and it fascinated us both independently. We never talked about it. But it's again to show how powerful out-of-school factors are on the assessments we give in school. So here's the case where we see that Asian immigrants exceed the overall mean Aussie and New Zealand student scores. So we see that family and culture are incredibly powerful. What's the takeaway from all this? You cannot get better schools by concentrating merely on schooling. You need to recognize the power of outside-of-school factors, as every Maori in this room does, and I've been listening to it for a couple of days. You have to have strong cultures and schools that are compatible with those cultures. You can't solve it with getting teachers' master's degrees or raising their salary or recruiting. It's not all inside the school. In studying these issues, I've come to realize something that is not much discussed, namely that with very few exceptions, a teacher's effect on individual lives and their effect on group data are quite likely to be different. The context, the cohort, the composition of classes and schools strongly affects the group data obtained, the test scores that a class or school provide for national exams, NAPLAN, NAEP, or the international tests. Teachers are much more likely to affect the scores of individual students. Teachers can have huge effects on individuals, and some have had those effects on me. My career, my life, is owed to teachers that took an interest in me and changed me. Some of my kids have had that same effect, the biology teacher they had. My daughter did not do well in her biology test. She did not get a high score in her biology class, and she loved biology, and as in her life she becomes an advocate for the environment. A teacher changed her life. And that's what's important at the individual level. The myth that teachers in schools and dropped-in principals can make a huge difference in the lives of kids in poverty or from cultures that are not the ones from whom our schools were built is, I'm afraid, just that, a myth. We teachers are no less important in the lives of the children we teach, but we're much less of a determining factor in the overall or aggregate test scores that our children yield. Well, what else did we try to demystify in this book of ours that's coming out? I personally hated the policy now being spread called move on when reading. If you aren't up to snuff in third grade reading tests, you are left back, you're flunked. Or as the politicians who advocate this policy said, you will be given, quote, the gift of time, unquote. But these politicians and educators and parents who like this policy are exactly like those who deny evolution. They are really wrong. They are denying pretty darn good scientific research. Flunking kids, as we used to call it, has a long history as policy, and also a long history as a research topic. But that history and research is thoroughly ignored by the contemporary policymakers. In 1975, and what I'm going to try to do is give you a flavor, we try to use the research to debunk the myth, okay? In 1975, 44 studies of retaining children in grade were reviewed, and the evidence failed to support the claim that retention was a sound education policy. 10 years later, in a review that included an additional set of studies, the researchers looked at students who were about equal in performance, some of whom were promoted, some of whom were not. The promoted students had higher academic achievement, better personal adjustment, and more positive attitudes towards school than did the retained students. 17 years after that study, yet another researcher reviewed the evidence, old and new, and concluded that most of the comparisons showed no significant differences between promoted and retained students on measures of achievement or on personal and social adjustment. However, in those studies that did show a difference, the results favored the promoted students, especially on measures of academic achievement. The most recent of the many studies showing negative effects looked at the Just Read Florida program, legislation proudly supported by then-Governor Jeb Bush, now a possible presidential candidate and no friend of education. The law resulted in thousands of third graders being left back. The research found that grade retention significantly increased the likelihood of disciplinary incidents and suspensions in the years that followed for both boys and girls. But Florida was so proud that its national assessment scores went up, conveniently forgetting that a whole bunch of 4th and 8th grade students who were taking the tests were 1 year over age because they had held them back. You know, it's pretty easy to get your scores up if you hold kids back, make them work on the stuff that you're going to test them on for a whole extra year, and then you move them along. Duh, scores go up. In sum, the overwhelming evidence is that this educational policy is not effective for the vast majority of those left back. It harms parent-child relationships, results in more negativism towards school by the retained student, produces greater absenteeism, and produces greater dropout rates for those left back, meaning a burden on the community because that child will likely not be a big taxpayer and may in fact need fiscal support or be more likely to be incarcerated later in life. And we must add to all this that in the USA, the retention policies are discriminatory against males, Hispanics, and African Americans. Middle and upper social class families who have kids that are slow to read get them tutors, and so they are rarely the ones left back. The policymakers talk about giving children having trouble learning to read the gift of time. But when children were interviewed about being left back, they said it was the emotional equal of, get this, ask the kids, get this. The children said being left back is the equivalent of wetting their pants in school or being caught stealing. Only 2 events were more distressing to them, the death of a parent or going blind. The gift of time, indeed. It's cruel policy. I'll share another myth that we particularly enjoyed writing about. This one was spread by one of Arizona's great fake think tanks, the Goldwater Institute. I say fake because they seem not to be able to think very well. Darcy Ann Olson, we name names, the president of the ultra-conservative Goldwater Institute, writes, quote, "For nearly 40 years, local, state, and federal governments and diverse private sources have funded early intervention programs for low-income children, and benefits to the children have been few and fleeting. There is also evidence that middle-class children gain little, if anything, from preschool. Public preschool for younger children is irresponsible, given the failure of the public school system to educate the children currently enrolled," unquote. The conservative ABC network newsman, John Stossel, joins the critics. He argues that universal public preschool of the type that President Obama is now promoting is a scam. His major source of information? A private for-profit preschool provider, apparently afraid that if the government provided preschool funding, as President Obama has championed, she would lose her paying customers. But what does the research say? It says that these people are really full of feces. My wife is here. She said, "Don't use your New York language." So, okay, I didn't, okay? The blatant bias of some of the critics against the poor and minorities is common and nasty when they discuss kindergarten and preschool. Robert Weisberg recently wrote, quote, let's listen to this, quote, "We cannot assume that low-income parents actually want their children's vocabulary upgraded or exposed to the art and music favored by the upper middle class. For these low-income parents, a physically safe, clean and nurturing environment with flexible hours is probably paramount. Narrowing academic gaps is undoubtedly far down their list for quality daycare," unquote. The nastiness of this person. Now that's one I'm going to punch in the nose if I ever meet him, okay? Mr. Weisberg should be made to answer to the great educational philosopher John Dewey. Dewey said, "What the best and wisest parent wants for his own child, that must the community want for all its children. Any other ideal for our schools is narrow and unlovely. Acted upon, it destroys our democracy," unquote. I agree. Although we are not sure they are the best and wisest parents, it is clear that the wealthiest parents in the United States pay handsomely for preschool and kindergarten. Tuition at the Horace Mann School in New York City, ironically named for one of America's greatest proponents of free education, currently costs $39,000 US a year for preschool. Would the critics of preschool and kindergarten call these parents stupid? I don't know. One recent study by economists in the UK examined data from PISA for the UK and Sweden, both of which had extensive programs of early childhood education, but the programs were not universal. That is, among the 15-year-olds tested in 2009, about 30% had not attended preschool. Not surprising, when they were younger, participation in early childhood programs was correlated with social class. The children of wealthier families throughout the Western world participate in preschool education at high rates. These researchers asked what the effects would have been on PISA literacy scores if all the children in Sweden and Great Britain had gone to preschool, not predominantly those from the higher social classes. Their conclusion? In the United Kingdom, students in the lowest social class grouping benefited from preschool and on average by an increase of 9.2 points on PISA, while those in the top social class grouping benefited by 5.5 points. In Sweden, individuals in the lowest social class grouping benefited from preschool by an increase of 7.8 points on PISA, while those in the top social class benefited by an average of 4.1 points. Universalizing preschool apparently helps all children, but it helps the poorest children the most. These researchers estimate that the United Kingdom, which would have improved 12 ranks, and Sweden would have improved 7 ranks had their nations had universal preschool. I don't know what you do here in New Zealand, but it is highly likely that universal high-quality preschool will result in higher achievement and higher achievement scores for your children. The same researchers also found that in all of the 34 countries in the EEC, students at 15 years of age who had attended pre-primary education for more than 1 year outperformed those who did not by an average of 54 points. Even after controlling for social background, attending preschool for more than 1 year increased performance by 33 points. The people who are against preschool in my country are simply lying. They're making it up. It's in their self-interest not to pay for that. They don't want to pay the taxes. And they particularly don't want preschool for poor kids, for brown kids, for black kids. Their own kids are going to schools like the Horace Mann School at $39,000 a year. In addition to all this, we have a Nobel laureate in economics telling us that it's one of the best investments you can make for a future life. A couple of other of these myths we've decided to take on in a couple of minutes. One is about charter schools. I'll just present the data and not give much background. These are the 4 top-rated, nationally recognized charter schools in Arizona. They're called Basis Scottsdale, Basis Tucson, Great Hearts Academy Chandler, Great Hearts Veritas. And here's some data on those schools. The percentage of students eligible for free lunch, meaning poor kids, 0, 0, 0, 0, average for the state 35%. In other words, not a single charter school recognized for its excellence has a poor kid. Well, duh, scores can go up. Percentage of students who are English language learners, 7.1% in our state, 0, 0, 0, 0 in those schools. Percentage of students with IEPs, meaning special ed, under 1%, 2%, 1%, 3%, 12% for the state. You get the picture. They are skimming, they are creaming, and then they say how well they do. They also do something else. For example, here's one of those schools, and you will see, let's just take the top one. In 5th grade, they had 150 students. In 6th grade, about 155 students. But in 7th grade, it dropped back to 120. Then it goes down to about 90. Then it goes down to about 45. Then in 12th grade, when they graduate kids, there's roughly 20 kids. And then they have the nerve to say, 98% of our kids go to college. They just dumped 90% of the kids. Okay? You can see the bottom graph is the same. I have graphs on all these schools that are exceptional, that are skimming, creaming, dropping, dumping. Okay? Your Minister of Education assured me that you have safeguards for your charter schools. We take on another one that private schools or private schools are better than public schools. In my country and in Europe and other places, there's this myth that private schools are always better. You have very few here, I'm pleased to learn. But here's just the graph. I won't give you the background on it. If you look at Catholic schools, Lutheran schools, conservative Christian schools, other private schools, and charter schools in the U.S., and you look across that top row, you see that for most of them, they score above the public schools. Okay? And the charter schools score 6 points below the public schools. As soon as you put in a social class factor to control for social class, you get the bottom row. Catholic schools are under public schools, Lutheran schools are under public schools, conservative Christian schools way under public schools, other private schools under, and charter schools are still under. In other words, these schools are filled with kids whose parents are either wealthier or highly motivated for education. And so they look good. But the minute you control for that, kids of those same kind of parents, it all disappears. Okay, so the adoration of private schools over public schools is misplaced because of that. Let me conclude. Although I can talk about the other 40-something myths and lies we have chosen to confront, I must stop and just recommend that you do the same. I have shown you the form of protest we have chosen, my colleagues and I. Please feel free to use it. Each of you might write an essay about the silly beliefs held by ministers, newspapers, leading politicians, and citizens, and get it published in your magazine. Hand it around. Start good conversations. I want you to know that we wrote our book in part because we think that a war is raging for the hearts and minds of Americans. At stake is the nearly 200-year-old institution of the nation's public school system, the institution that, more than any other, is responsible for the evolution and preservation of the oldest, most successful constitutional democracy in the world. Opposed in this war are two formidable combatants. On one side are the forces of corporate America seeking to gain a share of the billions of dollars expended annually in support of K-12 education. Enlisted in their cause are hundreds of conservative politicians and a network of right-wing think tanks. On the opposing side stand thousands of academic scholars, scholars in training in our universities, and a bunch of beaten-up practicing teachers. we stand unapologetically with the latter groups. We hope our views on these 50 issues at least start interesting conversations, because we are deeply concerned that without public conversations about our public schools, we could actually lose them. So thank you for inviting me. I hope something I said is of use, that you keep on developing your schools, your economy, and most of all, your democracy. Kia kaha, be strong.